I once had a friend and mentor who was obsessed with knowledge. Whenever we spoke, he always critiqued or challenged my assumptions about the world, and in return, I became a more critical thinker. His name was James Hoggett, and he taught me the power of narrative. Now, in a couple of seconds, I'm going to show you the true power of narrative, but before that, I'm going to ask you all in the audience to take a deep breath, and as you exhale, I want you to imagine the following story based on historical fiction as if it were unfolding in front of your very eyes. Ready? On 3. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in and breathe out. Once upon a time in 510 BC, a young Indian street musician set off on foot to journey across Asia. Carrying a small double-barreled drum, he met musicians from other nations on journeys of their own. Most notably were the Greek Empire's artists. At that time, a man named Pythagoras had devised a blueprint for the same musical scales we use today in Western classical music. As the Indians and the Greeks crossed paths and exchanged cultures, eventually they would return home with their new discoveries and shape musical culture for centuries to come. Hundreds of years later, in the 15th century AD, the British arrived in India to expand their powerful empire. At this time, a British man who arrived in India was an expert, particularly on Western classical music, as it had evolved from the time of the Greeks. One day he was taking a walk as he saw a performer on the double-barreled drum in a public area of Mumbai. Interestingly enough, this man was a descendant of the same Indian who had met the Greeks generations earlier. And so the men convened and started to produce music. And together, they synthesized a beautiful fusion that emerged from the interactions between the Western and Indian musical systems. And it sounded something like this. Now let's take a moment to quickly reflect about what just happened. Out of the chaos of ancient Greece and India, empires which sought power for their selfish gains, came the beauty of information sharing between the Indians and the Greeks. Centuries later, out of the chaos of colonialism, came the beauty of cultural fusion. And even today, the tradition continues as people try to strive to find a common link between disparate frameworks. And that's what I hope to do for you today. Now, accompanying me on the mridangam, the double-barreled drum, is Abhinav Seetharaman, my friend from Columbia University. Abhinav and I met during my first solo debut concert in India. And at that time, it is quite unusual to see someone take up a traditionally Western instrument and try to adapt it within the Indian framework. But it wasn't the first time, however. The violin, for example, was introduced to India by Portuguese Christian missionaries. And likewise, the mandolin was introduced to Indian classicism in the late 1900s. But interestingly enough, here's the perplexing problem. The violin took 100 years to fully get integrated into Indian classical music, and the mandolin less than 10 years. And for the keyboard, 20 and counting. So here's my dilemma. First of all, why is it that some instruments took longer than others to actually garner acceptance? And moreover, why was it that one could not just simply pick up an instrument, gather knowledge about another culture's traditions, and seamlessly innovate that instrument into an instrument of cultural exchange? These were the questions I hoped to answer as I started experimenting with my keyboard. Now, I started Western classical and Indian classical lessons at around the same time, and when I entered middle school, I dreamed of reconciling both styles on the same instrument, just as there were two cultures within my one identity. It was not an easy task. Traditionalists in the community were telling me that the keyboard as a solely Western instrument was incapable of rendering Indian nuances. My teachers at home told me to abandon the keyboard and take up a new instrument altogether. And this was discouraging, because if culture's claim to fame is that it is malleable, then is it truly sensible that certain instruments be confined to specific cultures? I experimented day in and day out with this instrument and went through 4 generations of settings to ultimately arrive at the current iteration. Finally, I gave my first solo concert in India, and for the first time, through the applause and reviews of my former critics, I was told that my efforts were successful. I felt validated. I felt that my music represented the Western-Eastern mosaic, or in the words of Felix Mendelssohn, the essence of the beautiful is unity in variety. And throughout my experience, I learned what makes these cultural systems so unique. I've studied their intersectionality, and I've collaborated with other musicians to incorporate my Indian training within a Western framework and vice versa. And as an ambassador to this dualistic system, I've learned that to an outsider, although it may initially seem that another culture's musics are disordered, upon further introspection, we can all find that there is indeed a beauty that exists within that randomness. Every note, every scale, every rhythm, every emotion is created from an infinite array of possibility with sound and rhythm. So here's exactly what I learned. As I illustrated to you in the beginning through my story of the Greeks and the Indians, I told you that the nexus between music in India and the West is one that predates itself in the Greek era onwards, the intersectionality of the music. Now in India, Western classical music was popularized through the advent of British colonialism. As the Indian film industry began to boom, Western conductors came and sought to integrate themselves into it. And in 1935, the Bombay Symphony Orchestra materialized, and the legacy has since continued. But in the West, acceptance of the Indian system is a far more convoluted system. The British initially regarded Indian music as ugly and primitive because it is representative of an inferior class. Gradually, however, they sought to control their colonized people by using their own culture against them. And so they brought over scholars from the West to India to study the arts. So in 1794, Sir William Jones came to Calcutta and founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And through his efforts, the British not only became more receptive to Indian culture, they actually began to document it and incorporate it into their own. Then, Indian music hit the shores of America in 1955 when a famous sitar player named Ali Akbar Khan performed in New York. And his efforts were completed by a world-renowned sitar player, Ravi Shankar, who I'm sure many people have heard about. Ravi Shankar collaborated with musicians from the Beatles and the London Symphony Orchestra, among other names. And through his efforts, he became the next icon of Indian music throughout the world. And since the 1960s, Eastern and Western music has grown even closer thanks to the efforts of globalization. Now let's talk about some of the more interesting concepts that I studied through my ventures. The first part of understanding this mosaic is understanding what defines it. And there are 2 aspects that fall within the mosaic. 1 is scale, and 2 is rhythm. Scale in Indian music is called ragam, and rhythm is called talam in Indian music. Now, a ragam, or a scale, defines movements up and down and tells you what phrases to use, what phrases not to use, etc. So, because of the variety that you get, there are ragas that describe different human emotions. There are ragas for describing sorrow. There are ragas for happiness. Ragas for jazzy moods. There are ragas for power and vitality. And so on and so forth. Now, here's what makes Indian music so unique. Number 1, in the Western classical system, we use something called solfege, which is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, whereas in the Indian system, we use sa, re, ga, ma, pa, da, ni, sa. On top of that, Western music has 12 notes called semitones, represented by the keys of the keyboard. In Indian music, we use even more called microtones. And if you look at the keyboard, which is the instrument I play, you can start to see why it's so difficult to replicate Indian music on this traditionally Western instrument. I would be required to play in between these keys in order to effectively render an Indian classical piece. How do I do that? Easy. We use something called the gamaka, which is a controlled pitch bend. Essentially, we do this. And with that glide, we are able to hit the notes in between the frequencies that exist in the keyboard. Now, in the Western system, the equivalent would be something like the glissando, but it's not as controlled and precise. Now, let's talk about the Western system then, because the Western system is also very unique in several fundamental aspects. Number one, being the concept of scale. In the Indian system, a scale is rigid. In the Western system, it is fluid. So that means, for example, if I'm taking a basic C major scale, in Indian music, I would be prohibited from playing or, whereas in the Western system, I am allowed to deviate from the central scale in what is called an accidental. Moreover, in the Western system, we use something called polyphonic music, multiple tones played simultaneously. That's why in a Western system, you might hear a chord played like this. In the Indian system, our music is monophonic, or single note melodies played in a given order, so you might hear something like this. And it's rare to see a chord played. The second overarching feature of this mosaic that we're describing to you is called thalam. Now, thalam is a very interesting concept because it basically defines rhythm, but it is a lot different in both styles. We can express rhythm verbally, or we can express it physically. If we're doing it verbally, in the Western system, we might do something like counting off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Or we might beatbox like I did in my a cappella group, like that. But in the Indian system, we do something a little bit different. We use specific vocal percussive syllables like this. Takka dhimmi takka jannu, 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 takka dhimmi takka jannu. All right, now let's take the simple 8-beat cycle as an instance. There are 8 beats, so it's pretty easy. And to actually show the cyclic time in Indian music, we use our hand. We use claps, fingers, and waves. So for this 8-beat cycle, it would go something like this. Clap, 2, 3, 4, clap, 6, clap, 8. Clap, 2, 3, 4, clap, 6, clap, 8. And when we want to keep it a little bit more intricate, we can actually divide each beat into 4 subunits, so 8 times 4, 32 subunits. That gives us a little bit more speed and complexity. So if we want to do this, it would look something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Dakka dimmi dakka jannu, dakka dimmi dakka jannu, dakka dimmi dakka jannu, dakka dimmi dakka jannu. So, what can I do with 32? Why did I just do that? What is the benefit? Well, here's what it is. In the Indian system, we throw in random intricate metric flows, or what we call metric modulation in the West. That's where I can take a shift in the rhythm of 4 and throw in 3, 5, 7, 9, 3, 5. So that adds up to 32. And when you do the math and you try to do it with your hand, it goes something like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Takita, taka, takita, taka, dimmi, takita, taka, dimmi, taka, takita, takita, taka, takita, tam. And it ends right on the beat. And that is the beauty of Indian rhythm. And talam is what defines the metric. It's what defines the essential pulse of any song. So when you take the beauty of the rhythm and you amalgamate it with the beauty of the melody, you get something like what follows. So, why does any of this even matter? What we say and think about the intersectionality of music, these mosaics that we've created, do they apply to culture as a whole? I believe they do. I found that through the synthesis of our own mosaics, we can begin to understand the reality in that cultures aren't mutually exclusive. My junior year of high school, I met a friend named Pond, who was a foreign exchange student from Thailand. And Pond told me that he saw his experience of trying to fit into American culture not as a reconciling of differences, but rather as a celebration of the idea that there existed a hidden bridge between our cultures that he was trying to cross. And I learned a lot from his words. I realized that our musics, our melodies, our mosaics, and even our lives are not merely our own, but rather were the reflections of the intersections we've had as a people with everyone whom we have interacted with, both in our past and our present. I also realized that our barriers to culture, the way we transcribe the chaos of our lives, or the manner by which we create meaning, don't have to divide us. Now, culture may be our first prescription of identity, but it is not the only one. And while we can all learn something from that, because even if it is difficult to find unity within a variety of traditions, there always exists a manner by which we can find and transcend those borders, whether it's the beat of our own drum or the sound of our own music. And when we innovate to tradition, and when we try to take it in terms of a progressive standpoint, then we bring light to the famous Chinese proverb that you can't clap with one hand, you need two. So on that note, let's realize that our legacies lie within our capacity to harness chaos and create beauty from the mundane. Together, let's make music. Thank you.